Hopefully this works today. Last time our last meeting didn't. Yeah, so the recordings have started. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining the Danish user group today, Power BI. It's a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure for me, at least, to see you present. And this topic is very interesting. DirectQuery. Perhaps you should work on the name, because it's we have to extend the session length in order to say the full name. So
yes,
welcome to you, Chris, and welcome to the rest of people joining us here this Tuesday evening. So I have prepared as any slides, so I will just leave it to you, Chris, to take it from here. And in the chat, please use that if you have questions, and I will have a look at the chat during the session, and we'll perhaps pause during the session and
if it's okay.
If
it's okay, I'll take the questions at the end, because I've got.
Yeah, okay.
I think we've got some time at the end. I'm always a questions at the end type person.
Let's do that.
Cool.
I will keep track of them.
Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
We can.
Not anymore.
Nope. So
Chris
I think we
left the meeting.
I think we lost Chris. He's back. You're muted, Chris.
That didn't go very well, but let me try again. Like I said, I've got a dog food build of Teams, so hopefully let me try again now.
We can see your desktop and now your presentation.
Good. All right, let's get going. Okay, so hello everybody. My name's Chris Webb. I work at Microsoft on something called the Power BI Customer Advisory Team, which means I advise customers about Power BI. That pretty much sums it up. And today I'm going to be talking about a feature with a very long name, DirectQuery for Power BI Datasets and Azure Analysis Services. Now, it's a long name. It doesn't sound very exciting at all, but I promise you it is the most exciting feature that has ever come to Power BI. And don't take my word for it. If we have a look at some of the online reaction for when we presented this feature for the first time, here's our friend Marco talking about this very feature, saying this is the holy grail. It's a historic milestone. So my job in this session is to not only tell you what this feature is, but to get you as excited as Marco is about using it. And I promise you, you will get excited. This is a great feature. So what are we going to do? First of all, I will try and give you a very quick summary of this feature. This is the second time I've done this presentation. The first time I did it, I realized that I'd spent about 25 minutes talking about kind of technical build-up stuff before I did a demo, and I don't want to do that. I want to have a nice demo right at the beginning to make sure you see exactly how cool this is. Then to really understand how it works, we'll need to go back to define some terms to kind of really understand what DirectQuery and live connections and datasets really are. Then we'll talk about the benefits this is going to bring. We'll talk about some use cases, talk about how, the things you can do with it. We'll talk about when it's going to be useful, when you probably shouldn't use it, some things to watch out for, and the long-term roadmap for it. I work for Microsoft. I will not be able to tell you everything that's happening in the future, but everything that I talk about here will be publicly available somewhere. And then at the end, we can have questions. And if you ask me questions about things I'm not allowed to talk about, then I will give you kind of very roundabout answers again. Okay, let me try and explain this feature first of all. So right at the beginning, I want to get you excited. So let me try and explain what this feature is. So what do we have here? We have an empty Power BI desktop file. And what do you think about when you see an empty Power BI desktop file? I see potential. I see almost something like an empty canvas that I can paint a picture on, where I can express my creativity. Now, if we're thinking about Power BI as being like painting a picture, I would like to think that when I build my Power BI dataset and build my Power BI reports, what I end up with is something like this. This is in fact one of my own pictures. I call it Eric Svensson asking Chris Webb to present at the Danish user group. The guy on the beard, guy on the beard is Eric, and the guy with the toned abs is me. So yeah, this is this is what I would like to think a pictorial representation of my Power BI dataset is. But we all know that sometimes when we open Power BI, and indeed sometimes when our end users open Power BI, we don't get this, we get something more like this. And it's not the end user's fault that we end up with this, because building a Power BI dataset is difficult. So wouldn't it be great if we had a way to help our end users build something that was good, but also allowed them to express their creativity? Give them enough help to be able to follow the rules, to make sure they're not doing anything bad with the data, but also let them do, kind of build something that is useful for them rather than what we just give them. So maybe something a bit more like this. Something where we've got some strict guidelines, but you can still color in and express yourself properly. And that's what I would say DirectQuery for Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services gives you. So let me do a demo of what it actually means, jokes aside. Here's my empty Power BI dataset. I have, if we go to the Power BI service, a workspace, and it's got a number of datasets already published up to it, including one called sales. Now, in here, we've got some sales data, and I want to build a report on top of it. So I can go to Power BI Desktop, and I can get data, go to Power BI Datasets, choose that option here. We wait for a moment. We'll see all of the datasets in the entire Microsoft tenants, which sometimes takes a little bit of a long time. Go on, and then I can say you on live. There's my sales dataset. Click create. And this is not new. This is something I've always been able to do. I'm just going to be able to here at this point build a report on top of a dataset that's been created by somebody else, maybe that's been published up to the Power BI service. And I can see the data in the dataset. I can see the tables. I can build a report. But up until now, the thing I haven't been able to do is to customize the dataset, to bring in my own data, to do my own calculations, to mash things up a little bit. And that is what this new feature, DirectQuery on Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services, allows me to do. Before December, all of these buttons up here to get data, once I connected to the Power BI dataset, they were grayed out. They are not grayed out now. Now, how can I do what I need to do? Well, all right. Here, I've got a view of what's in the dataset up on the service. I will upgrade to the new diagram view for now. It looks a little bit prettier. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click this button here to make changes to this model. This is slightly misleading in terms of names, but we'll talk about why in a moment. But I'm going to click to do this. A whole bunch of scary looking dialogues come up, which we will ignore for now. And magic happens. And effectively what I'm able to do at this point is to say, well, let me go to my local SQL server. Let me bring in a table of data that I don't already have in the published dataset. So I'm going to connect in import mode to my local SQL server. I'm going to go to the AdventureWorks DW data warehouse. I'm very old school like this. Bring in the dim customer table and load my data. Now, the original dataset that I connected to is still up there in the Power BI service, but somehow I've been able to connect to SQL Server to load some data into Power BI Desktop. I've got a dialog here saying potential security risk. We'll talk about this later, but for now I'm going to do what everybody does when they see a dialog saying potential security risk. I'm going to ignore it and press OK. I'm going to load in that dim customer data. I'm going to go to the diagram view. There's my dim customer table. It's got a customer key column on it that I can join to the customer key column here on internet sales. I could just build a relationship in the way that I would normally build a relationship. Click OK again. And what can we do now? Well, let's build a visual. I'm not generally very visual, so I'm going to build a table. Let's bring in calendar year here into a table. These things are always slower. There we go. There's my calendar years. This is from the published dataset. Let's go and get a measure from the internet sales table in the published dataset called internet sales amount. Let's bring in internet tax amount as well. So this is all data at this point from the published dataset, but now I can go to dim customer. Let's grab English occupation, put this on here as a slicer. And now let's just zoom in and I can select an English occupation. And you can see that I can slice on that table of data that I brought in here in Power BI Desktop. And it affects this table of data that comes from the source dataset that's still published up there in the Power BI service. So this is the payoff. This is the cool thing. The rest of the presentation is going to be all about other cool things that I can do on top of this. And it's also going to be explaining how this works and what's actually happened here. Right, let's go back to the slides. Before we carry on, in order to really understand what's going on, we need to understand some terminology. And Power BI has got a lot of complicated terminology. This feature introduces even more complicated terminology. Generally speaking, I find that people get really confused with a lot of terminology in Power BI. They get confused between what live connections are, what DirectQuery is, what a dataset is, what a data flow is. People use DirectQuery when they mean live connection. It's all very messy. Unfortunately, to really understand what's going on here, you have to be very exact with your terminology. Just as a quick advert for another presentation I'll be doing, in a month or so's time, I'm going to be doing a presentation with my friend Peter Myers from Australia, who I think has presented for the Danish user group a lot before, about purely around terminology for Power BI datasets. So make sure you see that. But let's think about the terminology that we need to understand for this particular feature. First of all, datasets and live connections. When you build a Power BI report, that Power BI report has to get its data from somewhere. And the somewhere that it can get its data from is either a dataset, which will eventually be stored in the Power BI service, or an external service such as Azure Analysis Services that behaves as if it was a dataset. Azure Analysis Services more or less shares the same engine that's used by Power BI to store datasets, so that's why you can use one or both. But a Power BI report can only connect to one dataset or one Azure Analysis Services model, at least directly. Now, when I started that demo just a moment ago, when I opened up Power BI Desktop and I connected to the dataset stored in the Power BI service, what I did was create a live connection to that dataset. So a live connection really just refers to the connection between a Power BI report and a dataset or Azure Analysis Services. So that's all a live connection is. Now, some more terminology we have to get past. Inside your dataset, you have tables. Tables is where the data lives. And tables in Power BI can store data in one of two ways, basically. They can store data in import mode, where the data is stored in memory inside Power BI, or they can use DirectQuery mode, where the data stays in the data source, and when Power BI queries the dataset goes away and generates some queries to get the data on demand from the data source. So those are the two storage modes. There is a storage mode called Dual that allows the table to switch between import mode and DirectQuery mode. And we're also able to create things called composite models, which is very relevant here. Composite models simply allow you to have datasets that are stored, datasets where different tables have got different storage modes. Now, this is not new. We've had composite models for some time, but up until recently, when you created a composite model and you had DirectQuery mode tables, those tables only supported DirectQuery against, generally speaking, relational databases. There are a few other non-relational sources like Azure Data Explorer that support DirectQuery mode. And so if we're thinking about this in terms of diagrams, if you've got a data set where all of the tables are in import mode, and generally speaking, this is what happens. Most of the time when you're building a Power BI data set, you're going to be using completely import mode. I've got my data set, the data is stored in memory, report, it generates a DAX query. The data is copied into the data set at refresh time, and that means that when the DAX query comes in, it gets the data from inside the data set and brings it back to the report. With DirectQuery mode, when a DAX query comes in, the data set generates a SQL query if we're going to a relational database. Oops, I've got my animations the wrong way around. I didn't check that. But the DAX query comes in, the data set takes that, turns that into one or more SQL queries. The SQL query results come back, and then the DAX query results go back to the report. So this is DirectQuery working on a relational database, which we've had for some time now. And as I said, composite models can have tables with different storage modes in. What's new? What does this new feature give us? Basically, this new feature of DirectQuery on Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services means that you can have direct query connections back to either published Power BI datasets or Azure Analysis Services databases. So it's not new. DirectQuery isn't new. Composite models aren't new. But what is new is that we can have direct query connections back to published Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services databases. And generally speaking, we will use these as part of composite models. It's important to point out that for now, this doesn't work with on-premises analysis services. It only works with published Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services. And it doesn't work with the SAP data sources that also act a little bit like datasets. So what we've got here is maybe a more complex picture. When we've got a report always still queries a data set. But this data set can be a composite model, and some of the tables in this data set can belong to a different data set. So my DAX query can come in. Animation's mixed up again, unfortunately. My DAX query can come in. I can go to my main data set. That's where, logically speaking, I'm getting all of my data. That can have tables in import mode inside it. That can have tables in DirectQuery going against a relational data set inside it. It can also have some tables in it that belong to a different data set or an Azure Analysis Services database. And when we work in DirectQuery on those, more DAX queries are fired off against this other data set, and the tables in that data set can themselves be in import mode or DirectQuery mode. This introduces a concept called source groups, which we'll see again in a moment. A source group is simply a collection of tables inside a data set that all use the same data source. And it also introduces a bit more terminology, local data sets and remote data sets. A local data set and a remote data set is simply a relative term. But if you're thinking about a data set that uses tables from other data sets inside it, that data set is the local data set, and the data set where the tables that we are connecting to in DirectQuery mode that's the remote data set. Now, don't worry, we're going to do more demos in a moment to explain what all this means. But what does this mean from a kind of Power BI developer point of view? What does this mean from a kind of BI architect point of view? Why are people so excited about this? Because it's not just a cool technical feature. This has the potential to change how we use Power BI completely. Now, throughout the history of BI, there has always been this division between corporate BI and self-service BI. On one hand, we've had corporate BI, which typically gets developed by very clever, very highly paid people in a central IT department. Somebody inside a company or an organization says, I need to be able to understand my data. I need to build some reports. And the IT person says, great, we're going to do this properly. We're going to go to all of the data sources. We're going to extract the data. We're going to build maybe a central data warehouse, or nowadays maybe a beautifully architected data lake. We're going to bring all of that together. We're going to clean the data. We're going to conform it, and then we'll build some central models. In Power BI, you'd build a big data set that gets all of the data you need, and it would be done properly, but it would be very slow. It would be very expensive to develop. It'd be very centralized. And typically what happens with corporate BI solutions, or what goes wrong, is that these projects take a really long time. And because they're being developed by IT people, they don't really understand what the business wants. And what the business wants often changes. The business often doesn't understand what the business wants until it gets something. And if something gets delivered by a corporate BI project, it's often late. It's often not what was really needed, and quite often there's pushback and there's anger from the business that this isn't really what they need. And quite often, because needs change, the business user says, oh, well, I now need this extra column. I need this new calculation. I need this particular customization, and it's Friday night and I need it for Monday morning. And I'll go to the IT people and say, can you do this? And the IT people will say, yes, we can make that customization in 3 months when you've got some availability. And that's no good for the business user who needs agility and they need their data. So what's the opposite of corporate BI? Well, the opposite of corporate BI is classic self-service BI. And this again has been around for many years. This is what people have been doing in Excel and Access since before you and I were born, almost. So with self-service BI, somebody in the business just gets some data from wherever they can. They load it into something like Excel. There are these horrible manual processes. It's slow, it's unreliable. It doesn't join up with anything that anybody else is doing with the same data. It's often wrong. It breaks when somebody goes away on vacation. You end up with multiple versions of the truth. You end up with the Excel hell that everybody knows about. But it's agile. It gives people what they want or what they think they want. And it often does the job. So up until now, we've had corporate BI on one hand, we've had self-service BI on the other, but we've had nothing in the middle, nothing that gives us the benefits of that properly developed corporate BI with the agility and customization of self-service BI. And that is what DirectQuery on Power BI Datasets and Azure Analysis Services gives you. It means that a BI pro, somebody in that central corporate BI department, can build that beautiful, big, centralized data set containing all of the data, containing that one version of the truth. And they can give it out to their end users. Their self-service users can connect to that and build reports on top of that. But at the same time, those self-service users can say, well, actually, I've got this other table of data that lives in a local database or lives in Excel. I can bring that in and analyze that as if it was part of that central data. They can add their own calculations. They can do their own renames of things, and they can build the reports they want. They no longer have to build everything from scratch. They no longer have to accept what somebody has built for them, and they don't need to go away and start duplicating work that other people have already done. So this is exactly why people get excited about DirectQuery on Power BI datasets. It allows that compromise between centrally developed IT goodness and self-service business user decentralized agility. Here's another diagram from some Power BI architecture showing that central enterprise dataset built by somebody and those local datasets built by business analysts, business users, getting that customization that they need, but still not duplicating the data, still taking advantage of all of the security, the centrally defined calculations, and so on. So what can we do exactly? Well, we've already seen in the demo so far that we can connect to a dataset and we can add our own tables to it. Well, let's go to Power BI desktop and see some other things that we can do as well. So just to recap, I connected to my central data set, and these tables with the blue column headers on here are the tables coming from my central data set. To go back to the terminology, these tables with the blue column, the blue headers, are part of a remote data set, and they all have a blue header because they are all part of a single source group, because they all come from the same place. And I was able to connect to my local SQL server, bring in the DIM customer table. Now, before I did that, I had to create a local data set inside this Power BI file. So now I've got a Power BI data set defined inside this Power BI desktop file. It's a composite model. I've got one table stored in import mode locally, and then I've got a DirectQuery connection to my remote data set that gives me these 5 tables with the blue headers in. And I'm able to build a relationship between my DIM customer table that's stored locally inside this data set and the tables in my remote data set. And when that happens, as you can see, I can slice on something on DIM customer, and the data that comes from the remote data set changes as well. But this isn't all I can do. I can do lots of other cool things as well. I can start adding my own calculations to this data set. I can add calculations on data that is in the remote data set. So for example, there is a customer key column on here. Maybe I want to see how many distinct customers have bought something. So I can right click here to create a new measure. I'm going to call this measure number of buying customers because this is going to give me the number of customers who bought something. DAX itself isn't particularly interesting, but let's just zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to say distinct count, internet sales, customer key. So there is my number of buying customers. We drag that onto there. Let's move this over. I can go to the table that I've just imported that's stored locally. I've got a customer key column on there. Maybe I want to see how many potential customers there were. How many customers are there for the current filter context in this DIM customer table? So I can go onto here. Let's create a new measure. Zoom in. Let's call this potential customers, and we'll do a distinct count on DIM customer key. So there's my new measure on the table that is local inside this local data set. I can bring that into my visual as well. You'll see that it only changes with English occupation, which is what you'd expect because there's no relationship between the customer table and calendar year. But I can also now build calculations. I can build measures that do calculations across both of these measures that I've just created. So I can go here and say, maybe I want to divide number of buying customers by number of potential customers and get a percentage. So let's do that. Build a new measure. And let's call this percentage buying customers. And let's divide number of buying customers by a number of potential customers. We'll format this as a percentage, and we can drag that in there. And this for me is incredibly powerful because now I've got calculations that can get data from my remote data set and for the data that I've just brought in. There's more. These have been measures, but calculated columns. I can now create calculated columns on tables in a published Power BI dataset. So the date table up here is a table that is in my remote source group that exists in that dataset that I've connected to in the Power BI service. I can create my own calculated columns up here. So I can create a new column on my date table. Let's classify our days into weekdays and weekends. Again, the DAX is not going to be very interesting here, but let's call this weekday type. And I can say if day name equals Saturday, or day name equals Sunday. This is going to be a weekend. Otherwise, let's call this a weekday. And there's my new calculated column. It's working on that remote dataset, but it's not visible in that remote dataset to anybody else unless they're going through this local dataset. This is a calculated column that exists in this local dataset on data in a table that exists in the remote dataset. But once I've created this works like, oh, hold on, that doesn't bode well. I shouldn't have done that. Let's put that on there. That looked like a little bug actually. But now I can slice by weekdays and weekends, and that's all working as you'd expect. I can do other things. I can create calculated tables. So I can create a new calculated table if I want inside my local dataset, getting data from my remote dataset. So let's just build this very quickly. Let's call this red product. Let's say filter product where product color equals red. That's going to create a new calculated table in my local dataset based on data that's in the remote dataset. So we should now be able to see my red products table here in my local dataset in import mode. And what else can I do? I can, sorry, let me look at my crib notes to see what I've got. Oh, yes, of course, I can rename things. Maybe I don't like my internet tax amount measure that has been defined in the remote dataset. I can go here and I can rename it. And let's just call it tax. So I can rename measures, I can rename columns, I can rename tables in my local data set, even when the underlying table, measure, or column is defined in the remote data set. So I've got an incredible amount of flexibility here for doing things, for customizing data, even when I don't have control over the remote data set. So this opens up tons and tons of possibilities. But as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. And perhaps one of the most important things that I can tell you here in this session is that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. This is me going to put my very stern voice on, and I am a person from Microsoft, and I'm going to tell you what we intend this for and what we don't intend you to use this for. We intend this primarily for scenarios like the one that I've just shown you, where there is a central data set that's already published, and you want to bring in one or two extra tables of data, maybe kind of Excel-like data volumes, to add to customize that single central data set. So most of the tables are going to exist in the remote data set. You just want to bring in a couple of other small tables of your own data to customize what's there and build a couple of relationships to make it all work. And maybe add your own measures, maybe doing a little bit of renaming, but not too much else. Now, that's our primary use case. That's what we want you to do. If you do this, you need to watch out when you're creating relationships, because as soon as you create relationships that maybe have got between columns with large numbers of rows in, or where data quality is a problem, you might want to run this problem. So I'll show you some examples of this in a moment. But this is our main use case. If you want to do this, that's great. There's another use case that it almost seems too silly to mention, but it's something that I get asked about all the time. And it is people who want to build a single Power BI report that gets data from multiple different data sets. And maybe they want to have one page in the report that gets data from one data set and one page on a report that gets data from another data set. Up till now, you couldn't do that. But with DirectQuery on Power BI datasets, you can. So for example, if I open up a brand new Power BI file here, we'll wait for a moment for Power BI Desktop to open up. While that's happening, as I showed you, I've already got a sales data set up here. I've got an inventory data set here as well, which has got some inventory data in. Hopefully Power BI Desktop has almost opened up now. Come on. It's always slow when you're watching it. And here's my new empty Power BI file. I can go away and get data against a Power BI dataset. Like I said, this is only slow because there are gazillions of datasets in the Microsoft tenant. But if I say, there's my sales dataset, remember at this point, all I've got is a live connection. This is exactly the same as the original demo that I did a moment ago. And that's connected up, that's got a live connection. We can in fact see here we've got a live connection. Also click this link to make changes to this model down here if I want, instead of pressing that button I did before. So let's do that. This is where I'm creating my local data set. And this is where I'm now going to have a direct query connection from my local data set up to the tables in that remote data set. So I'm going to add a local model. I've now got a data set inside my local Power BI file. And instead of getting data from a remote SQL server or a local SQL server or something, I can now go back and do what I did before, which is to get data from Power BI datasets connects to my inventory dataset and click create, I still only got one local dataset here. But now I've got two source groups. Each source group contains tables from either sales. I've got a source group for my sales dataset, I've got a source group for my inventory dataset. Let's upgrade now so we can see the nice colors. And what we can see here are now two colors. The light blue tables come from my sales dataset. They're one source group. The dark blue tables come from my inventory dataset, and that's one source group. And of course, now I can build a report on here with internet sales data broken down by calendar year. And data on this page just comes from my sales dataset. Here, I can create a new visual on here using just the tables from my inventory dataset. So I could go on here and say products units in and grab calendar year from here. And this page just contains inventory data. So this actually serves a real need, and there is absolutely no reason why you shouldn't go away and do this. Where can things go wrong? Well, at the moment, you can see I've got two different source groups and there are no relationships between them. If I start building relationships between these source groups, this is where we're going to start to have some very difficult, uncomfortable questions that we have to answer. Because look, my sales source group, I've got a date table. In my inventory source group, I have also got a date table. Similarly, I've got a product dimension table in my product inventory, in my inventory source group, and I've got a product table on in my sales source group as well. Really, what I'd like to be able to do perhaps is to be able to have one date table that controls both the inventory data and the internet sales data. How should I do that? Is that going to give me good performance? I'm going to be a little bit naughty and say this is perhaps out of scope, but Marco and Alberto have got a great video on exactly this topic, exploring all of the different options and all of the different performance implications. So go away and look at that. But at least at this point, understand that as soon as I do something like this, it will work. It may well work well, but there are going to be some questions that you need to ask yourself, some performance issues that might well arise. Other things that might potentially go wrong. So, for example, we might have problems with referential integrity. We might have data quality issues. Let me go back to my original data set that I was using for my first couple of demos, not the one that I've just shown you. And let me give you an example of this. Let's put a new page on here. Let's have a look at what's in the product category table. So I've got just two columns in here, product category name and product category key. Let's not zoom in before that comes. There we are. Those are the two columns. That's the entire contents of the product category table. I've got 4 product categories and I can see those keys there. Now, bikes doesn't have data, or one of them doesn't have data. But if I bring in, internet sales amount in here, yes, you'll see bikes does have data, accessories and clothing does, but components doesn't. But bikes does have data here. Now, let's say that I want to bring in some more local data. Let's say I've got an Excel file with some data in that I want to use to classify product categories. So I'm going to click on Excel here. I'm going to bring in this Excel file called product category groups. This is another table I'm adding to my local data set. It's going to be an import mode again. And let's see what the data looks like in here. So I have classified my product categories into low priority and high priority. this would be a great use case for this particular feature, but I've made a mistake. I have missed out the product category bikes. What are the implications of this? I've got a referential integrity problem. So if I load this data in, I can do something very similar to what I did before. I'm going to load the data in. I'm going to go to my diagram pane. Come on. There we go. Let's find the product category groups in here. And I'm just going to build a relationship between product category key here and product category key here. It'll come up as a one-to-one. Click OK. All seems to be working nicely, but look at the data here. Accessories, bikes, clothing. I now want to bring my product category group onto here as a slicer. And if I see slice by high priority, I see clothing. If I slice by low priority, I see accessories, but bikes aren't in high priority or low priority. We've got a referential integrity problem, and bikes are not available regardless of what I select here, unless I select nothing. You can imagine all of the kind of problems that this might well cause for us. So these kind of referential integrity problems are ones you're going to have to be extremely wary of, because in those situations where people are just bringing in some data from Excel or from some other external source, I guarantee you'll have data quality issues like this. Another issue to watch out for is related to how joins between source groups work. So as we've seen, one of the key features here is the ability to build a relationship between two tables that exist in different source groups. And one question that I get asked all the time is how does this work? Is there some kind of clever in-memory stuff going on that makes all this work super quickly? Well, there's a lot of cleverness, but basically there is no magic at all. There's not very much that we can actually do, really. We don't have many options to make this work. So I'm going to show you how this works. And then when I show you how it works, you will understand why it might be a problem, both for performance and also why we saw that potential security risk dialog box that popped up a moment ago. So let's go back to Power BI here. Let's go back to our main screen. And remember, we've got here our table getting data from our sales source group and our local customer table. And we can slice and dice and it all works. Now let me collapse all this. Let me go to View and open up Performance Analyzer. I'm going to start recording, and let's just refresh all visuals. Now here we can see our table visual. That took 840 milliseconds. We're not dealing with a lot of data here. We're not even dealing with any complex calculations. And that took almost a second to run. Now you might think, oh, that's all right. But if I was Marco, I would be very worried by this, because 840 milliseconds for a trivial amount of data and not very many calculations, well, it's okay for the end user, but what's going on here? What's happening? Why isn't it like 20 milliseconds? Well, what we can do is we can expand that, and we've got this copy query option here. This allows me to copy onto the clipboard the DAX query that was being generated for this table visual and some other queries that happen in the background. So let's copy this query, and I'm going to go to external tools. External tools allow you to open up third-party community developed tools, and one of the best third-party community developed tools is DAX Studio, which allows you to run DAX queries. I'm going to open up DAX Studio connected to the local data set that I've got here. And I'm going to paste my code into here. What do we see? Well, first of all, I've got the DAX query here that is generated by that table visual. So that visual generates a single DAX query against my local dataset. But remember, this local dataset has a direct query connection back to the dataset that sits in the Power BI service. And in direct query mode, when you hit tables in a dataset, that in turn generates queries against the original data source. So in this case, when my local dataset had a query come in, some of that data needed to come from the remote dataset in the Power BI service, and to query the remote dataset, the local dataset generated another DAX query. And that second DAX query is the one we see down here. Now, this DAX query has to say, well, here is my selection on English occupation. There don't seem to be many values here, but that selection on English occupation, in order for this relationship to work, has to travel down to this table. And how is that relationship built? Well, that relationship goes between the customer key column on here and the customer key column on here. So my selection on English occupation on this table gets translated into a selection on a whole bunch of customer keys, which then need to travel down into a query on internet sales. And that's exactly what we see happening in this DAX query. So what we see are all of these individual values here. Now, all of these integer values are integer values from the customer key column, which are being transferred across to the remote source group. And if I scroll to the right, you can see that we've got a lot of customer key values here. And you can imagine that filtering on thousands and thousands of customer key values maybe isn't going to be very efficient. So this is exactly why you've got to worry about performance. But this is how joins between source groups have got to work. Now, we're coming up with all kinds of optimizations that will improve this in the future, but this is fundamentally how it works. So this is why I'm saying you need to be worried or be careful of high cardinality joins, because high cardinality joins could end up with big long lists of keys that look just like this. What about that potential security risk warning, though, that we saw earlier? Well, what's happened here? I have taken data from my local source group and sent it away up to the Power BI service where it can be run against the remote source group. Now, these integer keys don't really mean very much, but what happens if I was doing something like using social security numbers or some personally identifiable information to build my relationships? It's a bit naughty, but people do it. What have I done? Well, what I've done is I've taken from data from my local dataset, and I have sent that embedded in a query to my remote dataset, where perhaps somebody with admin rights on that workspace could perhaps run Profile through an XML endpoint and see these queries and see all of these values embedded inside these queries. And maybe I've just leaked some personal data and I've broken the law and got into trouble with that. So that's why we're seeing the security risk dialog pop up. So again, you need to be very careful and understand what's going on in the background here. But I don't mean to scare you too much. This is all still good stuff, and I'm sure in most cases you won't run into too many performance problems or actually leak personally identifiable data. But remember, when you do lose your job or you do have a terrible performance, Chris from Microsoft told you to be careful about doing this. A few other things to point out. At least at the moment, row-level security only works within source groups. So row-level security, if you define it in a remote dataset, works. Row-level security can be defined in a local dataset. Sorry, I've got some old terminology on this slide. But row-level security cannot pass from a remote dataset to another remote dataset or a local dataset. This is actually a really complicated problem for us to solve. It might well be quite confusing to understand if we did solve it. So for the time being, it's just not going to flow. Maybe this will be changed after GA when we really understand what's going on. And then the final thing to say is that, like security, there are a lot of other things which at the moment don't work particularly well yet, because this is a preview. We haven't gone GA yet. You might see bugs, you might find performance isn't all that great. Things like calculation groups, format strings, sort by columns, they don't work completely properly right now. With each release of Power BI Desktop, and we're due one fairly soon, there'll be more and more functionality that gets enabled. And as soon as we get to GA, hopefully all of the most important functionality will be there, and all the performance will be there. As I said earlier, at the moment, we don't support connecting to on-prem analysis services models yet. If we did, it would only be for analysis services tabular on-prem. And even then, it would require you to upgrade to the next version of on-prem analysis services. It is not going to work with whatever version of analysis services tabular you're running on-prem right now, because we need to make changes in the analysis services on-prem engine to make this work as well. But the very last thing to say is that this is a massively important feature. It is a massively popular feature. There was so much excitement about this when the preview launched, and there are a lot of people out there using it. Almost every single large customer that I talk to has wanted this feature for a really long time. So it's an important feature. It's one that we are going to invest in long term. It's one that we're going to continue to invest in even after GA to improve and add to. So, don't worry about it. We are going to make it better and better. But we do need your feedback as well. So if you do try it, if you've got any ideas, please let us know what you think. But that brings me to the end of the session. And I'm now available to answer questions if you've got them.
We do have one question from earlier. When you, if you published the first data set you created, where you connected to the SQL Server, you would get a new data set, right?
Correct. There would be a new data set. So I would now have a new data set which contains data inside it and also had a DirectQuery connection to the original data set. I can even, after I've published that data set, create another data set on top of that. So I can do what's called chaining. I didn't mention this because this would probably really blow your mind. But you can have data sets which connects to data sets which connect to data sets. At the moment, I believe we limit that to just 3 data sets. Maybe we'll increase that. Something else that I didn't mention is that we will also have a feature that will stop, which will mean you can stop people building data sets on top of your data sets in case you think that that is a bad thing and you don't want people to do that.
Yeah, do we have Rasmus has raised his hand. Do you want to unmute Rasmus and ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Well, super thank you for this presentation. It touches on a lot of issues that I've been struggling with for the past few weeks. So I'm curious about this part about, for example, making relations between 2 published data sets. So you mentioned this, what I imagine would be a very common example of joining or making a relationship, the one-to-one relationship between two date tables. So you're saying the issue with that would be, I guess, that's also a high cardinality relation that would impact performance?
Yeah, maybe not such a, I mean, potentially on a date table. It depends on how many dates you've got. But yes, it's potentially a high cardinality relationship. And what happens if you have different date ranges? The date tables might be the same structure, but maybe one data set has a different range of dates in compared to the other. What happens, for example, if somebody has different surrogate keys on their 2 different date tables? There are all kinds of things that could go wrong there. So you need to be quite careful.
Okay, but if you imagine that they were exactly the same, because in our case they should be, then it shouldn't be a problem?
It shouldn't be a problem on a date table, because I don't think you'll ever have a really high cardinality relationship on a date table. You generally don't have more than a few years, a couple of years, and that could only ever be in the worst case, 1,000 or so keys. And even then, dates are one of those things that people almost always slice on in a report. So even if you're selecting a year or maybe 2 years, then, well, that's maybe what, like 700, 800 potential keys that need to be put in there. But I would highly recommend to watch Marco and Alberto's video on this. They published it in early January. It's a kind of free-form video, but it does go through a lot of these issues.
Yeah, it's one of these unplugged videos.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, next up is Joachim Andersen. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for doing the presentation, Chris. Just to build on Rasmus's question, would you ever delete one of the date tables if you have the two data sets instead of having date and date 2 and product 2? Would you delete one of them and build the relationship between the sort of fact tables?
You could do. I mean, you don't need to delete it. You could just build a direct relationship between the date table and the remote fact table. Like I said, there are a lot of different questions here. Marco and Alberto's video explores some of these questions, but this is one of those things where I think you would need to test, to be honest, because the best practices are still emerging. The product is changing every month. So you really need to see what works for you. And the other thing about date tables is that very often you have calculations like, time intelligence calculations that will rely heavily on selections on date tables, and that would have a big impact on performance as well. So test. Don't take my word for it. Always test, test, test.
Will do.
Okay, next up is Rafi.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. One is if you can, when you started working with when you started, like after you've have your data set for the first time, you wanted to change it, and then you had to say yes, I would like to change that into a direct query. What happens if you only say yes and just leave it there? Like, what is the behavior difference when having a shared data set and a shared data set where you said I want to change that into a direct query? Is there any technical difference?
There is a technical difference, but actually you won't, because of some of the optimizations we've done, you won't actually, or you shouldn't actually notice any difference in behavior or performance. Because in that situation, we should be clever enough to say, well, we've just got a local data set which just contains tables from a remote data set. So let's just take the DAX queries and run them as is against the remote data set.
Okay. And my second question is, are you looking into when you want to bring two data sets together to start handling all the integration problems, and by trying to conforming it again, for example, union the two date dimensions and remove duplicates and do all kind of stuff like that in a local M query, like transforming the data using M query, or is that like gonna?
That wouldn't be possible at the moment because Power Query can't generate DAX. Interestingly, Power Query knows how to generate MDX queries, but it doesn't generate DAX. So there would be a large chunk of work there to make Power Query speak DAX before that was even possible. But that's a useful idea. We don't generally work or plan that far ahead. What we do is we do something, see how it works, get feedback from customers, and that would be I could easily see us doing something like that in the future based on if we received feedback to say that people really needed a feature like this.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is Tom Tao.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for the presentation. I have two questions, maybe a little bit more on the elementary side. The first question is, you showed us the using the Power BI data set, and and then you will be able to create measures based on the query dataset as well as your local dataset. One of the challenges I have previously is when I was downloading or connecting to the remote dataset, there are some metrics, measures that have been created by corporate BI folks, but I cannot see what is actually be written on the text. So when I was trying to replicate that, I have some problems. So is it? You didn't demonstrate it today, or maybe I missed it. Is that a problem that will be solved?
I can't say whether it will be solved, but you're not the only person that is having that that problem. And personally, I agree it would be really useful to have that feature, but I can't make any promises about whether that will be solved, unfortunately.
Understand. Okay.
I don't want to be the person who says go to ideas.powerbi.com.
Yeah,
go to ideas.powerbi.com.
I will do that, but thank you. And second question is maybe a little bit stupid one, but how much memory do you have in your computer? Because
32 gig.
That's enough for Power BI, like some of the demonstration.
That's all I've ever needed. So it's quite a lot for a laptop, but yes, it's fine for all of the stuff I do. Absolutely.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Okay, next up is Rishi.
Hey, Chris.
Hi, Rishi.
I just wanted, so at the moment it brings in all the tables from the remote data set, right? Is there a way to limit that, maybe using perspectives or object level security?
No, you can hide tables if you want. There is the option to hide tables in the local data set. But again, I think there would be some extra UI work or something needed there to do that.
How does it work with object level security if that's applied against the remote data set?
It's not, because as I said, you can't do that. Object level security only lives within a single source group.
Right. Okay.
So I can't apply security in the local source group, that the local data set that has any effect on the remote source group.
Okay. And then with composite models, DirectQuery composite models against the relational source, you can switch tables and you can select specific tables to be import and some to be DirectQuery. Will that potentially be possible with DQ over Power BI datasets?
So you're saying that you'd want to connect to a remote data set. By default, all of those tables would be DirectQuery mode, and then you want to say, I want to have some of those as import mode and effectively copy them down to the. That's a nice idea. Ideas.powerbi.com. I don't do that just yet.
Not sure what I'd search for there. Okay, give that a try. Thanks.
Okay. Rasmus has another question.
Yes, thank you. It might be two questions. First of all, in terms of this whole performance thing, I'm thinking, since you're making a direct query to a published data set, so the connection is between this report and those data sets, in my case. So the underlying, for example, SQL Server and its performance, that won't have any effect on a composite model like this, right?
It depends. I mean, if you've got tables in direct query mode against that SQL Server.
Yeah, sorry, they're all import.
Oh, if they're all import, then no, that's not going to make any difference at all.
Okay, so it's like these, for example, relations between the two models that might affect it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. In import mode, all of the data is copied into Power BI, so you're never going to be going back to the SQL Server.
No, and is there anything in the setup of like your whole Power BI, I don't know, licenses, subscriptions, whatever setup you have that will affect the performance?
No. I mean, it depends if you've got, well, I mean, if you're using premium per user or premium or something, it's likely that you'll get different performance, especially at very large data volumes. But nothing that kind of directly affects, well, nothing that affects this exactly, I think.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah. The other thing is just sort of a very practical issue is that we've had the users who consume the report that is built on top of two published data sets. I've experienced that I spend a lot of time troubleshooting that they have specific visuals. Sometimes all the visuals like that won't show. So they can open the report, but then it says like can't display this visual or something like that. So I understand there's all these sort of things that you have to be aware of, that all the users who are non-pro needs to have build access or build permission to the underlying data sets. And you have to make sure that all credentials are defined on all the sources for the underlying data sets. Like there's all these sort of, in my humble view, sort of art details that you have to be aware of.
Yes,
especially this thing with giving them build access, which they won't be able to exploit anyway because they're non-pro users. Yes. But it's like, so these sort of weird things. And is that something that's going to be sort of simplified or something like that?
Yes, probably. I mean, the way we work with previews is we put something out that works well enough, and then we listen to feedback. So absolutely, if you're saying this is a crazy, stupid thing, then provide that feedback. We listen.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't always do what you want to do because we may disagree, or maybe we don't have the resources to change something. But yeah.
Well, one feedback would be that it wasn't the most intuitive thing to figure out.
Yeah. I think from our side, we would hope that it's at least documented properly so you can find out the solution.
Yeah, in all fairness, yeah, it was in a post back in December, yeah.
Okay, Rafi?
Yeah, I have another question around what you touched on that in the beginning when you talked about corporate BI and self-service BI. So basically, by allowing connecting to the official corporate models and then extend it with what you want, you can use that for all kind of exploratory and prototyping. But are you looking into and you also said something that there is a way of stopping users from manipulating with the published models. But are you looking into some levels of what is allowed and what is not allowed? For example, I could assume that it's okay from a data architecture perspective to say you can add your measures, but you cannot change the customer dimension to be called something else, or to change the net profit of a company. You're not allowed now to go and call it something else. So is there like a way of defining that from an administration perspective? And are you also maybe looking into a way of doing some classifications of those data sets, so that you have the corporate data set that has maybe an SLA and a model behind it, and then if someone is using that and manipulating it, then there is some kind of a warning saying you're looking into a manipulated data set that doesn't support I don't know, the corporate model. Are you looking into that in your
those
roadmap?
are all things we're thinking about, but I've worked at Microsoft long enough to say if it's not on the published public roadmap, we can't make any commitments about anything because things change all the time. But that's good feedback, and if we hear that from enough customers, then yes, we would probably do something like that.
Good. Marat, and we'll take the last two questions and then we'll call it a evening.
Yes. Hi, Chris. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I have a question about when you build relationships. You mentioned that you have to be aware of cardinality, but is there like any other things you have to be aware? And also, with regards to this, whenever I was building models, whenever I needed keys and IDs, I used to, like most documentation says that integers perform much better than strings, for example. But with the Vertipax engine, when everything is actually being with the dictionary encoding being converted to numbers anyways, is there any performance issue? So, like, for example, can you use just strings to make the relationships?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, string keys are text keys are pretty much always going to be longer than integer keys, and there could well be issues with that. I mean, there is a maximum length for a query, and if you did hit that, then you're going to have problems. So it's a good question. I don't know. I'm not sure anybody's done testing on that, and I think there are maybe 2 or 3 people inside Microsoft who would be able to give you an answer about that, and I'm not one of them.
But if it's not related to now the composite, when you do this with the DirectQuery, just in general, would you believe that now with the in Vertipack engine, when you have the dictionary encoding, then you shouldn't really pay so much attention if it's strings or integers when you want to make? Or do you still believe that integers are?
I mean, I still prefer integer keys, yes.
Yeah.
There are other advantages to integer keys, and I still prefer integer keys.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, last question of tonight. Hesham, or did we just lose him? I think perhaps, no. Hesham, do you have a question? No, he's still on mute. So thank you very much, Chris.
It's been a pleasure.
It was very interesting. And yeah, I've put in the chat the evaluation form. So please fill that out and give some feedback to Chris. And also, if you haven't seen it already, we have a session next week with Daniel Ottiger, who is going to present how to get started with the tabular editor, a must-have tool when you work with designing data models. And perhaps he will reveal the price of Tabular Editor 3.0. I don't know, but well, at least we can ask him on Tuesday. But again, thank you very much, Chris. It was a pleasure, and see you all at hopefully on Tuesday, perhaps, and have a good evening.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody.
You. Bye. Do you want to say something? No? You lowered your hand.